There's the light. Call the meeting to order. Please rise for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the April 3rd Post Falls City Council meeting. Shannon, please note that all council members are present. I would like to extend a formal, official welcome to the new police chief, Pat Knight. And I'm a little disappointed the former chief, Scott Hogue, isn't here because he's here so often. But we're going to let him slide on that one. We do have a few announcements. First, I would like to welcome James Laker, who's Boy Scout with Troop 420. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. And thanks for joining us tonight. Also, the annual tree giveaway is this Saturday, April 7th at 9 a.m. at Camellan Park Boat Launch. There's a limit of 3 trees or shrubs per household, and the list of tree species is available on the city's website. The City Center Parking Plan Open House is scheduled for Thursday, April 12th from 5:30 to 7 here at City Hall. Information is being developed to help understand what our City Center might look like in 10, 20, or 30 years. The public is invited and encouraged to attend. And we do have actually 2 proclamations tonight. The first is Fair Housing Month. Whereas April 2018 marks the 50th anniversary of the passage of Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, commonly known as the Federal Fair Housing Act. And whereas the Idaho Human Rights Commission Act has prohibited discrimination in housing since 1969. And whereas equal opportunity for all, regardless of race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, or national origin, is a fundamental goal of our nation, state, and city, and equal education and employment and housing is a critical component of family and community health and stability. And whereas housing choices impact our children's access to education, our ability to seek and retain employment options, the cultural benefits we enjoy, the extent of our exposure to education, outreach, and monitoring are keys to rising awareness of fair housing principles, practices, rights, and responsibilities, and only through continued cooperation, commitment, and support of all Idahoans can barriers to fair housing be removed. Now, therefore, I, Ronald G. Jacobson, Mayor of the City of Post Falls, Idaho, do hereby proclaim April 2018 to be Fair Housing Month in the City of Post Falls. And the second is the Idaho Crime Victims' Rights Week. Whereas Idahoans are the victims of more than 17,000 crimes each year affecting individuals, families, and communities. And whereas providing victims with knowledge of their rights and available services further strengthen their ability to recover from crime and trauma and restores a sense of self-empowerment. And whereas victims who believe they have a voice, empathy, and support are more likely to disclose their victimization, seek services, overcome the sense of isolation and distress, and participate in the justice process. And whereas a multidisciplinary response involving collaboration among victim services, professionals, criminal justice officials, legal professionals, medical and mental health providers, and community leaders is essential to reach and serve all victims, especially those who are marginalized, have disabilities, or live in remote locations. And whereas Idaho Crimes Victims' Right Week, April 8th through 14th, 2018, provides an opportunity to recommit to ensure that all victims of crimes are afforded their rights. And whereas the state of Idaho and numerous organizations, including the City of Post Falls, are dedicated to supporting and strengthening victims and survivors in the aftermath of crime, building resilience in our communities and our victim responders, and working for justice for all victims and survivors. Now, therefore, I, Ronald G. Jacobson, Mayor of the City of Post Falls, Idaho, do hereby proclaim April 8th through 14th, 2018 to be Idaho Crime Victims' Rights Week. Are there any amendments to the agenda?
We have none tonight, sir.
Are there, I'm chuckle, Shelley's voice is gone in case you didn't notice that. So, are there any declarations of conflict?
Nope.
Seeing none, Mr. Wilson, would you please present the consent calendar?
Sure. Item A is minutes, March 20th,
2018 City Council meeting. Item B, payables March 13th, 2018 through March 26th, 2018. Item C, contract with BCR Land Services for Tullamore Park excavation. D, Real Life Ministries Post Falls Campus Expansion Construction Improvement Agreement. Item E, North Place First Edition Subdivision Construction Improvement Agreement. And item F, Cash and Investments Report for February 2018.
Are there any questions on the consent calendar? I had one, and I got an answer. I was just looking at the year-to-date expenditures on Reclaim Water Operating Fund, and so I asked that question of Shelley, and she explained it to me, so I guess that question doesn't need to be addressed, but a number didn't make sense to me until she explained it, so.
Jason could stand up if you want to put it on the record.
Okay, so what I was asking the question on was, when we look at the Reclaim Water Operating Fund total budget was 8.8 million, and to date only 857,000 have been expended, which was 9.7%. When you look how far along we are in the calendar year, that one didn't make sense. And the other dealt with the capital fund, where we had budgeted 218,000. Actually, it looks like we'd expended 635,000.
Okay, good evening, Mayor and Council. On the, let's see, it's the budget status report under Fund 650. Under the operating line, there is an operating line of $6 million for replacement fund. That will be, if it's spent, it will be spent toward the end of the year, but currently it has not had any money expended out of it. So the total in that line item year-to-date is the $857,000 as of the end of February.
And then how about the capital expenditure? Was that going to be a reallocation as we move forward?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it will be.
Okay. All right. No other questions? With that, I'd entertain a motion. Thanks, Jason.
Move to approve the consent calendar as presented.
Second.
Motion second. Further discussion? Shannon, please take the roll.
Wilhelm.
Aye.
Borders.
Aye.
Anthony.
Aye.
Malloy.
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thorson.
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you. We do have one public hearing tonight, Plaza 41 Special Use Permit Appeal. And if anyone wishes to testify, there are forms on the dias in the back. Oh, I'm sorry.
Let me interrupt you just for a second.
Perfect.
This is a bit of a different creature than we normally have. This is an appeal hearing tonight
Okay.
from a final decision rendered by the Planning Commission. So the rules are a bit different tonight than they are in a typical hearing that you have before you. Because it is an appeal, the decision is based on the record that was created by the Planning Commission. So staff, based on our hearing procedures, city staff will present the recommendation or the decision that was reached by the Planning Commission and provide argument as to why they think that the decision was rendered correctly. They have 20 minutes to do that. The appellant has 20 minutes to essentially argue based on their understanding how the decision was reached incorrectly. And then staff would have 15 minutes as rebuttal time. There will not be any additional public testimony tonight because the record was established before the Planning Commission. And this is hopefully the only time we'll do this. Our procedures have changed since then. This has been processed under our old rules. So under our current rules, once for all applications that came in after those rules were adopted, appeals will be heard by the City Council as a brand new de novo hearing. So we'd have a full-blown hearing.
Thank you for that clarification.
Your options tonight essentially are to approve the appeal, which would then essentially mean that you're overruling the Planning Commission decision. You can deny the appeal, which is upholding the decision of the Planning Commission, or you have the option to order a new public hearing.
Yeah. Lynn, you had a question. Do you want to ask that of Warren right now?
Okay, my question was, for our purpose tonight, we can only address the C7, C9 issue of record, is that correct?
Those were the two that were included in the appeal.
That were denied.
So let me pull up the
You want that?
packet.
Warren, did you want to see it here? Would that help?
I've got it here. I'm just pulling it up.
I just thought before we open the hearing, that might, it'd be nice to know.
Yeah, essentially, they've highlighted the areas where they think the decision was deficient. So that's the gist of what we're here tonight to address.
Okay. With that, I'll open the public hearing. John?
Good evening, Mayor Jacobson, Council President Wilhelm, and members of City Council. So you kind of already going to go over the gist of where we're going to go with this. So the owner of the property is GFP Inc. The applicant's rep is Jillian Kairos from Smith and Malik attorney. And the requested action is to reverse P&Z's decision regarding the multifamily in the community commercial services zone and allow the construction of multifamily at the R3 development standards. The project location is, as you see here, just west of Highway 41 along Covington and Primrose Lane. This here was a snapshot of the proposed project at the time of the request, where it showed, looks like an ingress off of Central. Where that's located is right at that location, running east-west. Rather, this map here, you can see the north is running to the right of the screen. And another exit going to the north right about this location. There's about 3.8 acres for all the parcels included. The current land is vacant, and water and sewer would be provided by City of Post Falls. But as we stated, really what we're looking at is that the criteria and the findings for the reasoned decision by the Planning and Zoning Commission. So the first one of the criteria is, would this implementation of a special use conform to the purposes of the applicable zoning district? So the determination was that due to the proximity of an industrial use to the west, that the criteria would not be met, as it would compromise that potential user. Looking at the existing zoning at the time of the application, since then, where you see the gray box that's hatched, that's now zoned commercial. But, so that's the existing zoning here now is commercial for the site with industrial to the west and other commercial to the east and to the north. And you can see a little bit off the distance is various types of residential. Looking at the future land use, you can see here the proposed project site, commercial with the industrial designation to the west. And so this was the basis for that criteria one for their determination at the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. The next criteria deals with whether the proposed use constitutes an allowable use. They determined that this criteria was met. Third one is will or will not be compatible with the health, safety, and welfare of the public and with land uses. They felt like this criteria was satisfied. The fourth one is whether the proposed use will or will not comply with the goals and policies found within the comprehensive plan, and they identified it being consistent to the overall policy 7 in the comprehensive plan and residential policies 1 and 2. Those are the following. For the overall one was to encourage a balance of land uses to help Post Falls remain a desirable, stable, and sustainable community. For residential is that most ordinary activities would occur within a walking distance to most residences, allowing a measure of independence for those who do not drive. And then you can see there the other one deals with providing a range of housing types at different price levels. You can see in the staff report with the minutes, there's a lot of discussion pertaining to these potential policies from both staff and within the minutes. And I'd stand for any questions you have for me, if you have some for these.
Questions, John, at this point? Al?
John, could you go back to the first one, the reason for, that they said the criteria was not met?
Mm-hmm.
So due to the proximity. So I guess there's some clarity that I need on this because the applicant that's appealing the decision said that that the findings were different, that we found that it didn't meet the criteria as explained in C7 and C9, which aren't addressed there. Could you clarify that for me?
when I reviewed the findings, I thought C7 was the sole. I can defer to Warren, see if he can verify that, but I thought it was C7 stood alone as a reason for the criteria.
This was the C7 issue,
Yes,
was it not?
this is a C7,
Yeah.
correct.
So this was the residential next to the industrial. And
Okay.
it says number 1, but on the information we received, that's a C7 issue.
Okay.
Okay?
Seems like it's worded differently, though. It's like, in one respect, it's saying that the residential doesn't fit within here. But I think the applicant's saying, no, the way it reads is that it has to have a negative effect on the existing land user.
Yeah, I'm here to just present the findings on the basis of the Planning and Zoning Commission,
Okay,
and then they'll have their
Okay.
time
all right.
to speak to their concerns.
Warren, did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to offer to read what the criteria is and what the finding actually said if you wanted to hear it.
That'd be great.
So the C7 criteria is whether implementation of the special use would or would not conform to the purposes of the applicable zoning district. And then the determination by the Planning Commission says Municipal Code Section 18.16.010B2 indicates that the purpose of the CCS zone is to support uses that include retail sales or performance of consumer services and permits a variety of retail, professional, or service businesses, including some manufacturing, technical, or other professional uses. The section goes on to note that residential uses may be allowed within the zone at densities permitted by the high-density multifamily residential zone by special use permit when they will not compromise present uses. As such, the proposed residential use must not compromise present uses in order to meet the purpose of the zoning district. Ray Kimball testified that the residents of the proposed multifamily complex would support the surrounding retail and service establishments. This is likely correct, however, the site is also immediately adjacent to industrial uses to the west. We find that placing residential uses immediately adjacent to an existing industrial use will compromise the existing use. As such, we find that this approval criteria has not been met.
Okay,
Okay.
all right, I'm good.
And so what I did is I just
Yep.
synthesized it to a short version of that.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll get into it more with the
Applicant.
All right. That's all I have then, other than the fact that Kootenai County Fire and Rescue did comment as a neutral position regarding this matter.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Applicant. Name for the record, please, Ray.
Okay.
Get out of your way. Thanks, John.
Good evening, Mayor, Madam President, Council. My name is Ray Kimball. I'm a civil engineer with Whipple Consulting Engineers. I've been practicing land development engineering for, 18 years now. I'm a lifelong resident of the city of Post Falls, and I've been on the Planning Commission since 2013, as many of you know. Done a lot of projects here in the city of Post Falls, as well as surrounding areas. And staff here in the city of Post Falls does a very good job of vetting projects and making sure that those projects that actually see a public hearing meet the criteria of the code. The staff report that was prepared for this project for the Planning Commission and also for City Council here did support the special use permit. Unfortunately, and it happens every once in a while, the Planning Commission gets a little bit off track and made some errant findings. Those findings specifically, as you see in our appeal, are C7 and C9. C7 says that residential uses next to industrial uses would compromise the existing use. Now, what are the adjacent uses? There's STCU, Wendy's, Subway, Starbucks, Del Taco, Tax Return Place, Thomas Hammer, AT&T, Cricket, Numerica Credit Union, Domino's, FedEx office. Those are all to the west, or to the east, excuse me. To the west and a little bit to the north, there's a daycare, there's the Dutch Brothers, Agassiz Millworks, which is about 300 feet away. The actual building is 300 feet away from our site. There's Steel Structures of America. There's a professional office building, the ChemDry, and there are several other businesses. Interestingly enough, at the public hearing, there was no evidence presented as to how any of those existing businesses would be disbenefited. They talked about traffic, but they didn't present any evidence as to how or what kind of reasons would cause that this would actually cause them to close their doors or harm their business in any way, shape, or form. Conversely, it's interesting. Adjacent industrial use may not be perfect next to multifamily, but we have it in several places here in Post Falls. Senior Center is a great example. It's right across the street from an industrial use. It almost backs up to the log yard. Recently, we approved a zone change to R3 right adjacent to Idaho Veneer. And there are several other examples here in the city of Post Falls where industrial is next to multifamily. And it's important to understand that we all need to really understand that multifamily use is kind of a traditional housing. It's like me when I got out of college and I had some student loan debt, needed a place to stay, stayed in an apartment for a little bit. We've got many young engineers that come to work for us that have student loan debt. They're not quite ready to settle down and buy a house, and they live in apartments. And it's a 12-month lease. And if they don't like it, they move somewhere else. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. And it's also great for people who may be working some of the lower wage jobs next door, maybe working at Wendy's, working at Starbucks, Subway. To a lot of those people, there's probably a significant benefit to having a commute where they walk across the street instead of having to get in their car and drive somewhere to get to work. So there is a huge benefit. There's a benefit to the adjacent commercial uses where they're going to get people who are going to walk there to use their services. But at the public hearing, the only comment that had any sort of negativity had to do with traffic and how there are negative uses, or that an increase in traffic would negatively affect the adjacent businesses. Now, they didn't explain how that would negatively affect them. That there's no evidence as to how it was going to negatively affect their business or cause them to close or anything like that. They just said it was going to make traffic worse, and that was bad. I have here tonight with regards to, and I'll jump back because there was, Mr. Wolf, you had a question about finding C9 as well.
Yeah.
If you look in the packet and in the findings, C9 reads, as discussed above, we find the proposed use is not compatible with the industrial land uses to the west. Additionally, based on the testimony of Bob Scharf and Mike Agassiz, we find that placing residential uses in the vicinity of a high-traffic intersection of Highway 41 and Mullen is not compatible with the health, safety, and welfare of the public. As such, we find this approval criteria has not been met. So, with that, there was the testimony of Mr. Scharf and Mr. Agassiz with regards to traffic. I have with us tonight Mr. Todd Whipple, who is going to testify right after me here in just a moment.
Excuse me, there is no testimony tonight.
He will be talking, he will be part of the appeal.
So, just to be clear, the only thing that can happen tonight is argument based on the testimony and evidence received at the Planning Commission level. So,
Okay.
The appellant has the right to make an argument based off the testimony that's in the record. There is no right Frankly, it causes issues for us if there's any testimony about anything that's not in the record.
He will be be repeating his testimony that's in the record and talking about traffic.
Shelley, stop that while we... So I want to stop the time while you resolve this.
That would be outside the realm of a normal appeal. You typically don't have those types of things. I would leave that up to the council. That's their decision to make ultimately.
You stated he was going to be he would be commenting on the information he testified to as far as traffic?
Correct, in the record.
That's in the record.
That is in the record.
So we do have
Can
that.
Mr. Kimball just read the record if he wants to?
He can, and the only thing I'm going to caution you on is we've got a clock, and I don't know who else is going to be speaking, but you've got the time running down. So if you feel that if that's agreeable with council, and if he wants to read what is in the record that we have seen, I will allow you to do that if council does not have an issue with it. But the challenge is, on a timing issue, just, keep your eye on the clock.
I don't know that I need to hear from Mr. Whipple. I read the record, so I know what he said in the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting.
Yeah, I read that.
I don't necessarily need to hear him say it again. And I would be concerned that if he brings up something additional by his own error, that it blows the whole thing. It could, right? Because the only thing you can talk about is what was already said at
what we've
Planning
read.
and Zoning. So, Ray, I don't know if you want to go down that road.
We're reconnoitering here.
I would agree with Al.
Okay.
If he brings up any new information, we start over. Anything that's not in the record.
Okay, so I will now defer to our attorney.
Good. Thanks, Ray.
Thank you.
Thanks, Warren. Name for the record, please.
My name is Peter Smith. I'm an attorney with the law firm of Smith & Malek in Coeur d'Alene. Jillian Kyrus, my colleague, submitted the letter in support of the appeal, and I'm here to speak to it. First, I'd like to emphasize to the Planning Commission or to the council, that the only thing that you are to consider tonight is what we've just talked about, which is the record that is before you. And under the legal standard, you need to consider whether there's substantial evidence to support the position of the Planning Commission. And in this case, the evidence is severely lacking. As you heard from Mr. Kimball, there was an expert in traffic that discussed how this project would impact the traffic, and in fact, your own staff, the assistant city engineer, provided evidence, which is in the record, that this project would have a very little impact on traffic. Now, you contrast that with the lay opinion that was provided at the hearing as to traffic, and that it would have a substantial impact on Highway 41 and the intersections thereabouts. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion as to what a project will or will not do, and clearly any kind of development in this particular area will cause additional traffic. But consider the evidence in the record. The evidence in the record is any other use under the commercial zoning, community commercial services zone, would actually increase traffic to a greater extent than the current project. And in fact, I think it was multiples of 5 to 6 times greater in traffic. So just consider the evidence that was presented here. And certainly people can opine that residential uses do present a higher use in traffic, but the evidence that you have in the record before you does not support that. As you consider C7, which was the first element, it talked about whether or not this use would compromise existing uses in the area. The existing uses in the area, staff explained, are commercial to the west and industrial to the east. There was some brief testimony from the owner of the property to the east talking about 5 or 6 semi-trucks which are located there on his property, and that having this commercial next to that could have some sort of impact on the business. But again, you're looking for substantial evidence to support that position, and it's completely lacking from the record. If anything, it's just, my opinion is this project could affect the industrial use next door. If anything, maybe the industrial use next door would impact the residential, but vice versa, there was no evidence suggested. As you look around the area even further, you'll see, as the map showed, the number of residential uses and commercial uses which are very close to nearby, including retail, shopping, and other uses. So to say that this use would somehow compromise the existing industrial use which is adjacent to it, or vice versa, is completely lacking in the record before you. Let's talk about the traffic and safety issue. The record before you talks about the Highway 41, and I think this goes to C9, where the Planning Commission made the finding that a residential use this close or in the vicinity of the Highway 41 intersection, which I assume is the one with Mullen and 41, would somehow cause some detriment to the public safety. Well, I think anyone who drives Highway 41 and anyone who has been to what is referred to commonly as the malfunction junction on I-90 knows that there is an issue there. But to then jump to the speculation that people residing in apartments would somehow break the law and run across the street through the commercial properties and then across 41 to the other side, and somehow that would affect their safety, I don't think there was any credible evidence other than pure speculation that the safety of the public would be impacted by this project. As you consider all the evidence in this case, which you need to consider it as a whole, and look at it almost like a judge would, is the evidence here enough to support the Planning and Zoning Commission's decision? And certainly I would say some deference should be given to the Commission, but it's not a purely 100% deference. If their decision is arbitrary or capricious or lacks substantial evidence, then you must reverse the decision. And I would also point out that the property owner has a vested interest to do what they need to do with their property and develop it the way that they see fit. This is property that's in an urban renewal district. It's been sitting there for years as grass. A developer has now proposed a use which no evidence in the record before the Planning Commission supported their finding, and therefore their decision should clearly be reversed. And unless the council has any questions for me, I would just conclude by saying, as you consider the decision, please look at the evidence in the record which clearly does not support the Planning Commission decision, and it should be reversed.
Any questions, Mr. Smith?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No rebuttal in a case like this?
The staff is entitled to 15 minutes of rebuttal.
And he's shaking his head. So with that, I'll close the public hearing. Council, it's up for your deliberation. Who'd like to start?
I'll start.
Okay.
Well, I sat on planning and zoning for 7+ years and saw a lot of these kind of things come before us. And I'll be honest with everyone, I made some mistakes in making some decisions in terms of what we can and can't do as a city. Sometimes I spoke from my heart more than from my head. But I came to learn that we have rules in the city in the form of the ordinances and the way that they're written that we need to comply with. I feel that although I don't like the idea of having this development like it is, I have to go back to the way the ordinance is written. The ordinance says that those uses are allowed unless we can show that it has some ill effect on those businesses around it. I have to agree with the applicant. There was no real evidence that could show that those businesses were going to be impacted negatively. And I guess the other part of it was, aside from Mr. Agason, none of the other businesses around there came forward and said, hey, this is going to have a negative impact on my business. Even Mr. Agason didn't say this new development's going to have an impact on my business. He said, I'm going to have an impact on the development because I have an industrial use and I've got trucks coming and it's going to be loud and it's going to be smelly or whatever. So unfortunately, that wasn't met. The second one, I have to agree with the applicant once again. I couldn't find any evidence that was brought forward that said that the public health, welfare, or safety was going to be impacted by this development. So although my heart says I really don't want to have apartments on that piece of property, my head says I don't have any other choice. I'd have to agree with the applicant and overturn the decision.
Thank you. Carrie?
He was so eloquent. I don't need to repeat, but it's difficult because I have such respect for those who serve as volunteers on our commissions, and yeah, my thought is with Councilor Wolf's as well.
Mr. Malloy?
We don't have a choice.
Okay. Mr. Malloy?
To me, this is a flaw in our zoning codes, in that what we're looking at is an R3 development. I know the comparison was made to the R3 approvals that were approved next to Idaho veneer property. Those were brought in as R3 to start with. The future land use map was changed. There's a public hearing for that. The zone change was brought as an R3. Different considerations were given for R3 development, and those considerations include things such as how close is the industrial use, safe walking distance to parks, which this site lacks. There are various other considerations in an R3 to approve an R3 zone. However, those considerations are not taken into account when approving a CCS. So, congratulations, you found a loophole that even though you're proposing what is essentially an R3 in CCS clothing, we are not allowed to consider those other factors that go into approving an R3 development. Future land use map doesn't have to change. We don't have to care where parks are. We don't have to care about any of that. And we can't care about those things, in fact. So I have to agree with Councilors Wolf and Thorson that the way the law is written, this is legally CCS, even though it is for all intents and purposes R3. So I don't think we have any legal standing to uphold planning and zoning's rejection of the application. However, as an aside, I would like to implore Mr. Manley and Mr. Wilson in your efforts to update the zoning code to address these kinds of issues. That if something isn't for all intents and purposes, one, you can't be cloaked under the veil of another zoning, that all considerations must be met.
Thank you. Mr. Anthony?
That's also, when I look at this plan, I did have some concerns about traffic flow and looking at it, but then after listening to the evidence, there was real no proof that it will negatively affect those areas. And I think the way as Alan said, the way our code is written, legally we're to go by the evidence. And I think the evidence shows that they have met the requirements for the special use permit.
Thank you. Mr. Borders?
I have to concur with the other counselors. I did have a concern with the traffic, particularly on Covington and Primrose as it relates to parking along that street, because running trucks in and out of there along with cars to me would be a problem. But again, the evidence leads that we need to turn over the decision. And
Linda?
I also appreciate Planning and Zoning's commitment to this city very much. I spent a number of years there myself. I didn't make any mistakes like Al Wolf did, but just kidding. Anyway, I am going to move to approve the appeal.
Okay, let me comment first too. Well, actually, you made a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Discussion. I want to weigh in. I've been somewhat public with my comments. I'm very concerned with the number of multifamily units that we are building. I understand we have a need. I understand the vacancy levels are low. But the sheer number that we had 579, we have this, we have another 300 coming in. That concerns me. I don't know if it's sustainable. This particular issue on the traffic, that also concerns me, because Highway 41 is awful. But again, there's no concrete evidence to show that this would be any worse than the commercial or industrial development. As far as Mr. Agason and having an impact on multifamily, my comment would be you were there first. And we see that where people have properties. I remember when a development went in out by State Line Speedway, And Mr. Dolafield came and said, we make noise. And I think we have to bear in mind that they were there first. And this is a change, and there may be complaints, but, so although, again, I'm not excited about apartments, I would agree with all the comments made, and I think legally that's the route that should be taken. So we have a motion, we have a second. Is there any further discussion? Shannon, please take the roll.
Borders?
Aye.
Borders?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Aye.
Anthony?
Aye.
Malloy?
Aye.
Wolf?
Aye.
Thorson?
Aye, again.
Wilhelm?
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you very much.
So for clarity, from here, staff will prepare a written decision and bring it back to the council for approval at the next meeting.
Okay. Thank you very much. Next up is unfinished business, and tonight we have none. I'm sorry, we do. We have water master plan updates. John? Sorry, I almost overlooked you there.
I thought maybe I got to head out without a presentation.
Okay.
I'll give you that one.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. John Beecham, Utilities Manager for the City of Post Falls. Tonight, I'm here to present an update on an ongoing project, our Water Master Plan update. This is going to be a fairly short presentation. I already presented most of the details in the plan, I believe at a November workshop, but I will go through the project status, and then I have 2 specific questions for you. I'm really looking for some feedback from the council as to how to finalize this project. Our draft master plan was submitted to Idaho DEQ. They've had it to review and still do, as far as I know. I checked my email just before I came, and it still did not have any comments submitted back to us yet. Once those comments do arrive, our consultant will incorporate them into the draft, and we will bring back a final plan for your consideration. As part of that, I'm also doing some review internally on some of the financial options that were presented during that draft presentation. And those can be incorporated if we make any changes into the revised draft that would come back before you. When we presented the financial analysis, which is really sort of the culmination of the master plan, how much money do we need to accomplish what we're doing over the next 5 or 10 years? The consultant proposed a 3% rate increase annually to fund ongoing operations as well as capital projects. And the question was raised, what would it look like if we did not raise rates over this planning period? So rather than task our consultant with doing that analysis, I obtained the financial model from them, and we ran different scenarios in that. So what I have for you tonight are the results of those scenarios. And I have bigger graphs than this on the next page, but I wanted to put them next to each other for comparison. On the left-hand side is sort of the draft as you saw it at the workshop with a 3% annual rate increase. The red bars are our capital fund balance, and the blue bars are our operating fund balance. And one thing that's important to note is at the beginning of the planning period, which is right now, those bars are actually, the red bar is between almost $11 million. I don't know the exact number off the top of my head. And the operations fund is nearly $4 million. Our consultant and staff agreed that we could use those funds and decrease those balances in order to fund capital projects and ongoing O&M. We don't need at this point that much in the sort of in the bank, so to speak. So the intention of the plan was, rather than have large rate increases, utilize some of those funds that we do have in the bank toward projects. And that's where we started with this. If you look at the trend of both of those balances, the capital fund decreases to right around $4 million 10 years from now. And that is sort of assuming when the capital projects take place. The blue bars, which is our operating fund, decreases a little bit for the first 4 years, and that reflects a transfer into the capital fund to fund those capital projects. And then at about the midpoint, it begins to increase a little bit each year. We set a contingency fund target of 150% of our annual budget. And that is for things, we recently had a well motor went bad, the controls for the motor went bad, and in the process, it destroyed the shaft down to the actual pump impeller. All told, that will cost us about $70,000 to repair. So we have large expenditures that come up where we need reserve funding in place. So moving over to the 0% rate increase, and I'm going to advance the slide so you guys can see this in a little bit bigger detail. There's the 3%, and then this is the 0%. What you see in this case is the O&M fund decreases continually throughout the process. And what that means is at the end of the planning process, we aren't bringing in enough revenue to increase that fund up to that 150% contingency. We also spend down our capital fund to a little under, I think, $1.5 million, which if we have annual expenditures of about $1 million in capital, which we do, that gives you about 1 year of projects. At that point, we would have $0 in the bank, which means in order to continue operating or to build our next capital project, we would first have to raise rates, then wait for funds to accumulate back, and then build the project. So there could be a substantial delay. Similarly, we could decrease operations and sort of continually postpone capital projects if we wanted to continue that non-rate increase. And what this is really showing is that if costs escalate a little bit, we use 3% as an inflation factor in here, and we continue building the capital projects necessary for the system, we will effectively run out of money in about 10 years, which was, I think, the gist of the question asked. So rather than just look at 3% and just look at 0%, I ran another analysis at 1.5% rate increases. And in this, you see the O&M fund is able to be fully funded. That's the blue bars again. Those continue to tick up a little bit each year. At the end, they're fully funding that 150% contingency. We have a little over $2 million in the capital fund balance, which would be about a year and a half of capital projects. The exact number, I think, is in the memo I sent to you guys. I don't have it off the tip of my tongue. So again, this is a trend that is troubling to me if I was looking at capital projects out in the 2027, 2028 timeframe, is we have spent down our capital budget and there's no really room for that to be built back up short of a large rate increase. So, and that's sort of the findings of the financial analysis I did. I do want to talk about one capital project, and then my hope was we could talk about where to go with the financial analysis and then where to go with the project. If you guys would like to do questions at this point about just the financial part of it, that works for me too.
John, I have a question.
Sure.
You're talking about rate increase, and you're talking about the projects. Does that take into consideration any revenue generated from new growth?
There is a factor for new growth in there. I don't remember it. It's usually something like 1% in a planning model, which is probably appropriate in this case. We're not seeing within our water district the same growth the entire city is seeing. So it is factored in there. It's not a huge amount that we see.
Okay. Question? Okay.
I'll come back to these graphs later. So, what I'd like to talk about as far as a capital project is to review what I'm going to call the railroad crossing projects. These were sort of tentatively presented in our workshop, and I'm looking for a little bit more direction from council as to how to include them in the master plan. In the draft master plan you saw, these projects were funded using capital funds and user fees. Alternatives to that would be private developer funds or another funding mechanism like a LID or an urban renewal project. The projects we're talking about are two 18-inch pipe stubs that would cross Celtice Way and cross the railroad tracks to the north of Celtice Way. They're affectionately known as P6 and P7 in our master plan. And really the goal is to get across this sort of difficult barrier to development, put a pipe stub there, and then let the development community take it from there if there's demand. As I mentioned, it'd be 18-inch pipe stubs. That would provide the necessary infrastructure for eventually a 10 million gallon a day industrial area in that sector of town. That kind of matches industrial uses other places in the country, according to our consultant. It is a little bit hard to predict that because you could have a large industrial use with very little water consumption, or right next to it you could have a smaller building with a huge amount of water, depending on what they're using it for. This is kind of a middle ground for industrial use. The cost for both of them is a little over $1 million. I have a benefits and a drawbacks slide for your consideration. As I mentioned, this removes an impediment to development. We do get questions both from folks along Beck Road and along Pleasant View Road about when water might be available, largely for fire suppression reasons. This is a longer lead time project where you have to cross under a railroad track, which isn't necessarily attractive to folks who want to invest in something and get something built and start making a profit. Industrial land to the north, so as I mentioned, there's interest in water in this area. And this is also kind of an economic development opportunity where by building the spurs, you generate interest in somebody continuing that pipeline up to a new use for it. As far as drawbacks, the first one is cost. As I mentioned, it's a little over $1 million. And ultimately, if we're going to use ratepayer dollars for that, that affects rates and that affects other capital projects. There's really, you can't have it both ways. If you're going to spend money on it, that money comes from somewhere. It would take time and effort for myself and my staff to manage this project. So that's another, that's, I don't want to say hidden cost, but our efforts would be spent somewhere else if we weren't doing this. And furthermore, there's a question of timing. If this isn't done, somebody else may come and do it. If this is done, there may not be interest right away and the line may sit there for a number of years. I didn't run a financial analysis of what this looks like with the 0% rate increase because it simply makes, in my opinion, a bad situation worse. It's not really worth considering. But this is what it looks like with a 3% rate increase. And as you can see, the O&M fund essentially stays similar to what it did before. It goes down a little bit and then starts coming back up. The capital fund decreases in the 2022-2023 fiscal year. That's where the funds would come out for this project. And effectively, you see the same trend, but it goes down to right around $3.5 million instead of down to a little bit over $4 million. So as you would expect, you decrease your capital fund by a little bit more. This would not necessarily trigger an increase in the rate from 3 to 3.5 for recommendation, though. It sort of fits within the master plan one way or the other. Here are the 3% rate increases without the project and with the project side by side. Like I said, really the difference is right there in the middle with the capital fund. You can see it drops down. So at this point, what I'd like to do is sort of walk through, put these graphs back up, and take any discussion you have, and then we'll come back and go back to our consultant and incorporate any changes into the master plan if there are any changes. So the first thing before you, and feel free to ask questions, is should we maintain the recommended 3%, or should we ask them to go back and analyze it with a different number and bring that back in the final draft?
I personally would like to see it analyzed with the 1.5 or a 2% instead of the full 3.
Okay.
Just see what it would come back on that.
Is that something that you would have to go to the consultant to get those numbers, or you could go back?
At this point, yes. I've kind of taken the level of analysis that I can do as far as I can, and we would ultimately want to incorporate it into the master plan. So having them make that edit, I should back up and say in response to that, we'd be asking them to amend the master plan and include a rate increase that was different, adjust capital projects to make that balance out in a financially smart way. So it's not, we can't just say that it's going to be 1.5 and come back and see what that looks like at no cost to us. We can have, we can ask them to do that. They can prepare it and bring it back. If we want to change it back, though, at some point they're going to ask for more money to keep changing the plan.
Did they calculate these figures, or did you say you did this?
I did these calculations. They constructed a financial model and sort of showed me how to use it, but I think I put in here, and as well as in the staff report, these are planning numbers. It's sort of a what if we do things.
one thing I'm actually happy to see and pleasant surprise is even with the 3% annual rate increase, it's still drawing down the fund.
That's by intention, too.
Right.
We set it up that way from the beginning.
So at that point, whether we go from 3% to 2% or whatever, I think the overall goal is over time is to draw the fund down to a reasonable amount, and that's being done at a 3% rate. So personally, I'm satisfied with that. I like the trend, and I also don't want to be caught with our belts undone in case something comes up. So I think that's also financially sound so that people don't get hit suddenly with a massive rate increase or an interruption in service. So I do appreciate that the trend line is dropping in either case.
I had a question on the cost. We're talking about capital projects, but if we go back, two questions, I guess. If we go back to the consultants and ask them to modify, I'm sorry, consultants cost us a bloody arm and a leg.
They do.
And so I would make an assumption that there's no basis for, but that we would probably spend more with the consultants out of general fund dollars or out of these fund dollars to pay for them to update and or reanalyze the master plan and make a change than the 3%. Total dollar cost.
Total dollar cost, the 3% is a fairly substantial amount. I think for the consultant to reanalyze the financial side of things and maybe move a capital project out in priority, which is what we'd be looking at, we're probably not talking more than $10,000, $15,000 tops to redo those projects. So I appreciate where you're coming from. The consultants are expensive. We need to be careful asking them to do things arbitrarily, but
well, my concern
3% is a substantial amount.
Right, but my concern is even if it's $10,000 or $15,000 and then we look at it, we say, gosh, that didn't work, go back and change it, they're not going to do it for free.
That's correct.
So that would be a concern. The other question I have, when you were talking about, and I don't mean to change horses on you here, but when you were talking about the projects under the railroad?
Yes.
So if we incur that expense and then we get development down the road, is there any chance to recoup the cost of stubbing under the railroads from future development?
My answer is I believe so. I don't know if Warren would be willing to jump in on that
he's
really
always
quickly.
willing.
There's a potential. I wouldn't want to plan on it, put it that way, because it's an unknown when or if those lines would be used. We certainly have an ordinance that speaks to latecomers agreements. They don't typically anticipate that the city's funding that up front and then charging it ourselves. It's typically used to reimburse an outside entity who's put in public infrastructure. So this would be a little bit of an odd match. So I'd say it's a possibility, but I wouldn't want to count on it.
Okay.
And there would be the chance, like Warren says, that we build it and somebody doesn't connect onto it.
Right.
And it's very hard to collect that.
I had a couple things. John, I just wanted to compliment you on this report because this is really complicated stuff and I could even really digest this and it was easy for me to go, oh, okay, I get this. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I do not disagree with Councilor Anthony as far as I'd like to see those other numbers, but I don't know that I'd want to spend the money to see those other numbers. The way I would approach this is I think we should go ahead and do the 3%. I think we should go ahead and put those stub lines in. Two reasons. One, it's there, it's ready for development, and that's the type of development we want in the city. We want that industrial, that commercial type of development out there, and if we wait, it's only going to cost us more down the road. I see it as, and I like your thinking here too, Joe, that as far as those fund balances going down, if 2 years, 5 years down the road, we see that we've got the balances available, the money's there, we can always pull back on that 3%. We don't have to charge it, right?
That's correct.
So we can always go back and reassess it later and say, you know what, you paid 3% for 5 years, but the next 5 years you're only going to pay 1% or whatever we can do. So I would think that I would choose to go ahead and do the 3%, go ahead and kind of give you the green light to go after those under the railway stubs and and reassess in 3 to 5 years.
I would agree with Al. I think that's the prudent way to do it, and you obviously think that that's the prudent way to do it, correct?
I do think that, especially with regard to the 3% rate increase, I think that's the prudent financial thing to do. Building the stub lines, I personally think is a good idea for the reasons Councilor Wolf just mentioned, but I think that is really ultimately a policy decision, and I would support either answer on that.
Well, what it does is it removes an impediment. So, you get people that are looking to develop. If the water line is there and available, that takes a big obstacle out of their way, not having to deal with the railroad, having it there. Yeah, you do take a bit of a risk by spending the money now to hopefully facilitate, as Al says, the industrial type development on the west side. So, I would concur with those comments, Joe.
I'd like to offer a dissenting opinion on the stubs in that, if you build it, they will come doesn't always happen. And, it looks like about $1.4 million to put those in. That's a lot of money to ask from taxpayers to hopefully facilitate somebody else's future development. We spent a lot of money on Spokane Street right out here, hoping it would spur development in the adjoining property, and that has yet to materialize. So, as probably the minority opinion here, I'm not as excited about that. But as far as the 3% rate increase, the trend for funds on hand is dropping, and I'm satisfied with that part of it.
Thank you. Jerry?
Okay. I'm split. I agree with Joe on the stubs. That's a big chunk of money, although it is a good selling point, for future development. And I would go with the 3% and reevaluate that down the road.
Is there a timeline or a permit process that we have to get from the railroad to do these projects? If we go under their railroad or?
There is. My understanding of it, and our folks in the engineering department are more expert in this than I am, but if you bore under the railroad track, you can typically get it permitted in under a year. If you want to actually cut open the ground and cross it, you can probably never get it permitted.
That answers my question.
And I would like to offer one more idea here. This is a master plan. This is the direction we're intending to go today, and we're trying to set ourselves up for plans in the future. But I'm not asking for commitments that you'll approve the master plan today, or that if a project comes forward that's in the master plan, that's approved later on down the road. So there are many sort of opportunities to put the brakes on here.
John, quick question for you. If we opt to submit a application with railroad to bore under, that part of it's done. So now if a developer wants to come in, would they then be able to utilize or work with us for the approval that we had, or is there going to be a time limit on that?
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. My understanding from listening to other projects go on is that there's a time limit on it, but I'm fairly uncertain in my answer.
It would be interesting, in my opinion, to see if we could get a permit to do it, and then see how long that will last, and then not incur the expense of doing it until such time as we were more sure of the actual opportunity to bring in users out there.
Mr. Mayor, Bill Melvin's going to get up and speak to the...
Somebody said something.
Would you speak up, please, Shelley?
Mayor and council, actually getting a bore permit to push a utility underneath the rail lines, it isn't like a rail crossing that we've spent years and years on. They're actually generally you should be able to get one within a few months.
So that would not be a detriment?
No,
then?
I don't see.
Okay.
I think you would easily count on getting the permit. They're not problematic at all.
Okay. Steve?
Okay. I could support the 3% figure, but I'd like, as Al suggested, if some of these projects come in under bid, or if we see that growth is bringing in more income, that we thought it to be able to have the opportunity to reassess it and look at maybe lowering it in the future. Because some of the bid price, you don't know what they are now. It could be a higher bid, could be a lower bid. If some of these do come in under bid, then there'd be some savings there.
Well, not realizing that we could get thank you for that information, Bill. Not realizing we could get a permit within a couple of months. I was thinking a typical railroad crossing, which takes about 12 years.
Yeah.
So I would probably change my opinion on that as well. I was just trying to get ahead of the curve, but if the curve's not that big, it's not a big issue. So do we need motion on this or just direction?
I think what staff is looking for is just direction on how to direct their consultant to proceed.
So I think most all of us, if not all of us, agree with 3%.
That's what I heard.
And what's your thought? I know I would kind of change, Al, if we sit
Yeah.
tight on the board, is that all right?
Yeah, it's, like John said, it's not something that
Okay. Is everybody
have
okay?
to do.
Yep.
Okay with that?
Yep.
You said sit tight on that, so don't include that in our financial plan?
Oh, I think-
I just want to make sure I understand that.
I think you want to still
Include it.
include it in there, but
Include it,
not
but-
move forward with
Yeah, but it's not the green
actually
light to go
building the
more.
stubs.
And to be clear, this plan will come back with these sort of things in it for your final approval, so, and adoption.
And then I'm sure you guys will, but if you could do your best to try to segregate the cost of the bore separately from everything else, that would be helpful for me anyway.
Okay. I think that gives me answers to my questions. I
Thanks,
appreciate
Sean.
your time tonight.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for your comments, good comments. Next item on the agenda, citizen issue, which is the time allotted for citizens wishing to address council on a non-agenda item. Bob. Name for the record, please.
Bob Flowers. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Council. First thing I'd like to do is request that the council and the city employees do everything in their power to close that loophole that got exercised tonight. We have seen it time and time again with CCS suddenly becoming a multi-family, high-density process. Last month, in front of the council, I spoke neutral when you were approving their last piece of land for CCS zoning, and I told you what they were coming for. And sure enough, here this month, here they are with their, I just would love to see that closed so they cannot do it again. And I really don't just want one or two, I really would like some real work done on this to close that immediately, or we're going to have a whole load of CCS apartments, because that whole area along 41 is zoned that way, and it's wide open. And I mean, next week there's a plan, there's a hearing coming up for 300 more apartments. And that's just off of 41 also. So let's try to close this thing up before it just gets so carried away that we don't have any CCS area left anymore. It's filled with apartments. Because, believe it or not, the developers are picking up on this, and they will continue with these PUDs. The second thing I wanted to address tonight was the term public hearing. Because in the first sentence, it says, items listed as public hearings allow citizens to comment on the subject matter before the council. Well, I'm a citizen. I put in my paperwork, and guess what? I wasn't allowed to comment. To me, this is wrong, because it's listed right here in your agenda as public hearing, and it was posted as a public hearing. Thank you.
Anybody else? Next item up is new business senior center thrift store purchase. Dave.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I'm before you tonight to ask for your approval to make a purchase of the Post Falls Senior Thrift Store. I believe it's a win-win for the city. It's providing needed indoor recreation space that's not gymnasiums, and it's providing the senior center the needed money and a focus, allows them to focus on running the senior center. So, senior center as it looks now. What we're proposing is to purchase a 5,500 square foot building. It is pole barn construction, so it's wide open, which makes any additions or changes we make inside fairly easy to do. It's situated on just shy of 1 acre. Key point in it is that it is surrounded by city property, so this is kind of a landlocked item in there. The parking lot is accessed through the senior center. It is zoned commercial right now. There would be a change of use from that, though. It's still commercial, but it'd go from a business use to an assembly use. So that changes some of our numbers in what we qualify for. We're looking at about 300 occupancy on the building. Included in the report was the appraisal that had put a value at $418,000. To give you a better idea how the city land goes around, let's keep hitting that. This is Community Garden. This is Centennial Trail along here. This is Senior Center. That's the senior housing. Those are owned by the land is owned by the city. And then, of course, Black Bay Park, and the yellow is what we're proposing to purchase. What it looks like from above, that site, there's your parking lot, the building, and then that is, right now it's a garden area that they used. So we're looking at that. That may stay, it may tie into the community garden, which is just down from it over in here. It could also be a stop for the Centennial Trail. The fiscal impact of this purchase, we're looking at a purchase price of $275,000. We figured closing costs at 5%, which is high, but wanted to make sure we're running on the high end on those things. Site improvements, once again, we had a breakdown in your packet, but the high end, $175,000 for improvements. That's to bring it up to code, to meet our ADA requirements and required for occupancy. Yearly utilities, we're looking at $16,000 on that. The source of the funding for the purchase and improvements would be impact fees, and then the funding for the utilities would be coming out of the fees we charge. So, two of the programs that Tracy identified were the dance and the tumbling. That's getting ready for the dance recitals, so they're using gym space on that. The one on the right-hand side is the tumbling, and you can see where the parents are lined up around the mats right into the classroom. And that happens with most of our programs that are in the treehouse. It's just not a real conducive spot. So I've already gone over the budget. Breakdown professional services, $12,000. Architectural civil design is in there. The site improvements include curbing, concrete work, asphalt, where we patch, landscaping, irrigation to bring in the tree islands that were required for that, and parking lot lighting. Structural upgrades would include bringing up to 4 restrooms or stalls, and some of the walls, the windows, waiting room, electrical, which we do believe needs to be upgraded, and then for the permits and fees. This was just a rough concept. We'd like to have 2 rooms out of it and a waiting area. It's hard for the public to see, but a large room in here, a second room in here. Division on that's based on where some existing posts are. And you have, lobby, restrooms, and storage. That may change a little bit once we hire an architect. They'll tell us how the flows work best. Why this purchase makes sense to us is that the site is surrounded by city parcels. We don't want to leave an island within city property. We recognize that if another user were to buy it, we probably have to address some of the water drainage that goes on into it, and the city would need to do an easement off of their property to that. It does fit in with our collected impact fees. We do take in about 9% for indoor facilities. We do not have any earmarked at this time. We've, in the past, partnered with the Boys and Girls Club on that purchase or that construction. But it's a solution that will allow those two properties to continue to work together. As everybody who's gone to any of the senior programs, you do see some overflow. You see it going into Black Bay Park too, so it allows us to continue working. And from my standpoint, from my staff standpoint, the biggest thing is it's providing needed indoor facilities. The treehouse has been good for small projects, but for the larger active activities, it has caused some conflict. I'm open to questions.
Dave, the only thing I saw in it that really, I guess, doesn't cause much of a concern with the current real estate market, but the appraisals are a couple years old. And so I thought, well, do we need to get an updated? But when you look at the value from a couple years ago on the value determined, knowing what the real estate market's done now, and then looking at the price it's being offered for, I think it's a good price. So I don't think it's worth getting an update on the appraisal just because of that.
And I did look at that. One of the things I did is there's two half-acre parcels that are for sale, just raw land, just south of Sportsman Park. And their the asking price right now is $225,000 for the half acre. Bring up 1 acre, you're at over $500,000. Or no, 450. Sorry. That's why I'm not our finance director, and we're happy.
Yeah, Dave, I just got a couple questions.
Yes.
When I was driving this tonight, I noticed the seniors were having some activities there. I'm looking at a lot of your activities. You're looking at the 3 and after crowd. Is there enough parking there to accommodate both uses?
There's actually, when we ran the numbers with our building official, we have more spaces than we need, but there will be times where there's conflict. We will be working out a shared use agreement, and we've seen a few events where they've used up all of that space. They've gone over to Black Bay Park. In our master plan for Black Bay Park, we are looking at expanding some of that parking out in front of the building too.
Okay, and this might be getting a little bit ahead, but when I was reading through the snow plan, the senior center currently contracts for all their snow plowing. Would the city then take over the snow plowing for the senior center and that side also, or would that be maybe a trade-off or a shared use agreement? Or
well, we would take care of our portion of the parking lot. The nice thing is I have staff with the equipment. They're already out there doing a lot of the facilities. They're doing the smaller parking lots, so they would be right nearby. If the city council wishes to work on an agreement to do the whole parking lot, I know on occasion when they've had a special event, we've gone in and helped them, but that would be a council decision.
Okay. And are you looking at, in the revenue, is mainly programs generated through the city of Post Falls, so your department? Correct. Were you looking at any income from outside rentals or any other groups?
A small amount. The challenge is we need to staff it. One thing that will be different on this one is we'll have a small office space, so when we have part-time staff, they'll have a spot to be, and we'll assign them some work, or we may run our rec specialists or some of those things.
Okay. Do you give, would your instructor have access then to help supervise that, or will you have a staff person from your department completely? Or could they fill a dual role?
If we have a staff person there who's an instructor, they would act as a supervisor. Where it gets a little trickier is if we have a contracted employee, so let's say a local business, because we utilize a lot of contractors. We would not have them supervising a rental. That's outside of the scope of their contract, and we'd need to bring somebody in.
Okay.
Carrie.
On that, where Ron mentioned that was 2 years old on that market report, is there an assessed value from the county? I didn't see that. Did I miss it in the packet?
thought I saw it.
Yeah, I saw it. It was in
It's in
there.
there. Yeah, it was
County,
418,000.
It was lower.
It was significantly lower than
Lower.
the appraisal.
It was
Lower than the appraisal.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think my other question is, where you talk about the need for that indoor space for the dance classes and things that don't fit into the treehouse or the trailhead pavilion. Is the trailhead pavilion also used for classes?
We do use it for some, but every time we use it, it will impede with our rentals for weddings and anniversaries, which is where we make our largest profit margin on that. And the trailhead itself is carpeted, not real conducive for dance and some of those other activities.
What I also was wondering, and compliments to putting together a pretty comprehensive report, but we have a lot of dance studios. I mean, we have a lot of these things that acquiring physical space, I'm just not seeing that there's huge demand for the city to provide that kind of thing.
Yeah, if I could answer that, we run kind of the beginning levels. So we act as feeders for a lot of those businesses. We do have waiting lists for that, and that's been the function all along. And I would hazard to guess that some of those dance studios have come into our area because we're acting as a feeder. So, and if it does go away in the future, the gymnastics, once again, we feed into those programs. We don't offer, the full level. When I was in Mount Lake Terrace, we had a dance company, and we did go from the very beginning to the top levels that were out there. That's not the market we're in.
And then one more thing. Talking about if the city doesn't buy it, then we'd have to provide an easement for someone else to buy that building. Doesn't the senior housing have an easement on the west side? Because they have parking spots that are specifically for senior housing, so they come off of 3rd Street also there. So I'm thinking that isn't...
They come off of 3rd Street, but they don't connect to the senior center parking lot. There is a separation. You have a swale in there, and you have a height difference.
I know that there's at least a half a dozen spots would be the east side, but it's on the west side. Because I know Mamie from the food bank parks there, she lives there. But yeah, so I just know that I just don't see that as an issue if someone else purchased that building, and then if we had to, you say that the parking, there's a slope there?
And a swale for all the parking lot.
So, but you're saying that if someone else buys it, the city's going to have to remediate a slope that currently exists in the parking lot at the Thrift Center, but I don't think has been an issue for the Thrift Center since the 90s when that building was built.
It currently is not a problem, but if you have a change of use, depending on what they do with the property, you could have that.
They have to meet stormwater guidelines,
So.
That are in place now that weren't in the 90s when that was built?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think both the easement and the stormwater are kind of minor compared to the overall picture. Does it provide a needed facility? Are there funds available? Is the price right? So,
In my mind, the bigger issue is if you choose not to, then you're going to have a private island within city property.
Linda, do you have a question, comment?
I just have a couple comments. I think the price is very good from where I stand. I also, when I saw that picture of the inside of the building, I just have one question about that, Dave, where you have it separated into 2 rooms. If we're having so much interest in the dance and things like that, why not make, and this is just kind of a side note, make that wall removable so that you can actually do bigger things. The city is growing. Obviously, that's one of the reasons that you want this, is because you have waiting lists for your dance classes and things like that. I would just say to maybe forward think this thing a little bit and make that wall, so if you can put it there, but make it removable in case you need to easily have it removed to accommodate a different use. And otherwise, I would be all for
Yeah,
this.
you could put an accordion door in or something.
Something like that.
Yeah, that,
We could
Future.
bring that to the architect. The one experience I've had, because I've had facilities that have had them, is there's usually a lot of high maintenance to them because they don't, as they're moved in and out a lot, they don't always close right. But technology has improved, and I haven't had one of those for a number of years.
any other comments?
Just an idea.
Yeah.
That's a good idea, though.
Al?
I always like going last because everybody asks great questions, good job. But I did have a question about the money. You said we're going to pay for this with impact fees.
Yes.
Are these impact fees that are already in the bank?
Yes.
How much is going to be left over? Is this going to wipe out your balance, your budget?
Well, I anticipated that. Right now, we have 3.1 million in impact fees. Of that, we have, I can't add up that much, but I can tell you if we take, without the senior center purchase, all our projects that we have going on right now, from Tullamore to picnic shelters to Crown Point, Black Bay, that will leave us with 1.6. So at the end of this, with this purchase, we'll be at 1.1.
So those impact fees that you're talking about, $3 million, that's park and rec?
Yes.
Impact fees. They're not split out recreation and parks?
No. They do split out the indoor. That right now is at $370,000 for strictly indoor, which more than covers the purchase. Some of the exterior stuff still falls under park impact fees.
Okay. Okay. I like that. I guess the other, when I first looked at this, I thought, well, that's a lot of stuff, you know. But then, next council meeting, we're going to be talking about more and more annexations. Mr. Flowers brought up the fact that we're going to be talking about more and more multifamily, which means we're going to have more and more citizens. I do believe in providing recreation, so I'd be in support of the purchase.
I would move to approve the senior center thrift store purchase.
Second.
Motion second, further discussion. Shannon, please take the roll.
Anthony?
Yes.
Malloy?
Aye.
Wolf?
Aye.
Thorson?
Nay.
Wilhelm?
Aye.
Borders?
Aye.
Motion passes, thank you. And Cap McLean, thanks for bringing this to us, working with Dave on. Appreciate what you're doing over at the senior center as board president to get that back on track. So thank you very much for your efforts. Next item up is administrative staff reports. Any tonight?
Ordinances and
I'm
resolutions.
sorry, I skipped it. How about an ordinance with the City Center Urban Renewal District closing?
Move to place the ordinance City Center Urban Renewal District closing on its first and only reading by title only while under suspension of the rules.
Second.
Motion second, further discussion. Shannon, please take the roll.
Malloy?
Aye.
Wolf?
Aye.
Thorson?
Aye.
Wilhelm?
Aye.
Borders?
Aye.
Anthony?
Aye.
Motion passes. Mr. Wilson.
An ordinance of the City of Post Falls, Kootenai County, Idaho, reciting a brief history of the City Center Urban Renewal Plan approved pursuant to Post Falls Ordinance 774, directing termination of the City Center revenue allocation area established pursuant to Post Falls Ordinance 774, authorizing city staff to take all steps to implement this ordinance, providing for appeal of conflicting ordinance provisions, providing an effective date, and providing for other matters properly relating thereto.
Move to approve the ordinance City Center Urban Renewal District closing, to direct the clerk to assign the appropriate number and that it be published by summary only.
Second.
Motion second, further discussion. Shannon.
Wolf?
Oh, no.
Oh, that's
Aye.
catchy.
Thorson?
Aye.
Wilhelm?
Aye.
Borders?
Aye.
Anthony?
Aye.
Malloy?
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you. Now administrative staff reports.
None.
We have none. Mayor comments, don't have any tonight. Council comments. Mr. Anthony will bring back in the next meeting or two, you're going to give us an update on some of the things you've been sitting in on?
Correct. We have a committee going now to discuss snow gates and snow berms and possible recommendations to the council on that issue.
Perfect. Thank you. We need an executive session tonight. That being the case, the next motion is?
Adjourn.
All those in favor?
Aye.
We need adjourn. Thank you.